Petrol price rises spark chaos in Ecuador. Indigenous groups lead a nationwide strike demanding the reinstatement of fuel subsidies and an end to austerity. Why is President Lenin Moreno refusing their demands, and could the anger force him out? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Folly by Thibault. Ecuador's President Lenin Moreno is facing one of the biggest ever challenges to his power. Indigenous groups are leading a national strike against austerity measures. Violent protests began last week when Moreno removed 40-year-olds' fuel subsidies, causing petrol prices to double. Protesters stormed the Congress building in the capital, Quito, on Tuesday, but ministers weren't inside at the time. President Moreno moved the government to another city 400 kilometers away. He's declared a state of emergency and imposed a curfew in Quito. Hundreds have been arrested. Our Latin America editor Lucia Newman has more.
Indigenous Ecuadorians continue converging on the capital, Quito, to give their president an ultimatum. Either repeal highly unpopular austerity measures or get out, they say.
We've come from the middle of Ecuador to reject this unpopular government that's taken measures dictated by the IMF.
President Lenin Moreno says he's open to dialogue, but insists he can't back out of his commitment to reduce the fiscal debt by eliminating fuel subsidies, something he'd vowed never to do when he took office. The demonstrators were further angered when they found out that President Moreno had moved the executive branch overnight to the coastal city of Guayaquil. For hours and well into the night, protesters tried without success to overcome riot police in an attempt to surround the presidential palace and National Assembly.
Some of the indigenous leaders are asking them to move away so that they don't put their lives at risk and to march to another part of the city. But they're angry. They say they are not going to budge, that they haven't walked so far to turn back now.
The leader of the National Confederation of Indigenous People told Al Jazeera there would be no dialogue until President Moreno returns to Quito and repeals the decree.
If Moreno doesn't want to administer this country, where there's social chaos, where there's no social justice, no freedom, better he leave the country forever to join that other fugitive from justice, ex-President Correa. They can live together.
Moreno says the worst unrest in more than a decade in this country is being orchestrated by his former boss, and now his worst enemy, former President Rafael Correa, who lives in self-imposed exile in Brussels. Correa denies he's pulling the strings, but he doesn't hide his political ambitions, including the possibility of returning home to run for vice president.
Either Moreno resigns or he asks for early elections, which would be the constitutional and democratic way to overcome this grave situation.
That scenario may be premature, despite the mounting social unrest and political intrigue here. But then again, Ecuador has a very long history of presidents being forced out before their term is up. Lucia Newman, Al Jazeera, Quito.
Now, in addition to ending fuel subsidies, the Ecuadorian president announced a 20% wage cut for new contracts in public sector jobs. New government workers will have to give 1 day's worth of wages each month to the government, and holidays have been halved from 30 to 15 days a year. All right, let's introduce our panel now. In Quito, Ecuador, via Skype is Matias Zibell, a professor of journalism at the University of Azuay. In Paris, we have Guillaume, a former foreign minister of Ecuador, currently a researcher at the French Institute for International and Strategic Affairs. And in Manchester, in the UK, is Colin Harding, director of Latin Forum, a consultancy which provides political and economic analysis on Latin America. Welcome to you all, gentlemen. Thank you so much for being on Inside Story. Matias, in Quito, let me start with you. Indigenous-led protests have toppled 3 presidents in Ecuador in the past few decades. Just how serious is this current crisis?
Hello. Yesterday I was in front of the National Assembly watching the indigenous people trying to take over the building. They are a really strong force, and as you said, historically, they have been a really strong force. But for what I saw yesterday, I think they are going to need more allies in this fight against Lenin Moreno if they really want the president to step back with the austerity measures.
We saw some quite extraordinary scenes in Quito with protesters trying to storm the National Assembly building. Who's behind the violence that we've seen in these past few days? The indigenous leaders say they're not the ones behind the violence. So who is to blame for the chaos?
That is a really difficult question, and it depends on who you ask. If you ask the president, he says that the former president is to blame because he says, for example, that on Monday, the people tried to take over some parts of the Justice Department, and the president said yesterday, these are not indigenous people, these are the people of Rafael Correa, the former president. Rafael Correa obviously denies these kind of accusations, so depending on who you ask, you will have a different answer.
Well, let's ask Guillaume Long in Paris. Guillaume Long, you were foreign minister under Rafael Correa. Lenin Moreno is accusing Correa of orchestrating the chaos, this crisis, alongside the Venezuelan president, with the help of the Venezuelan president, Nicolas Maduro, he says. What do you respond to that? Is Rafael Correa indeed behind the current crisis in Ecuador?
Hi, thank you for having me on the show. No, I think it's absolutely preposterous. I think it's a classical case of scapegoating for the government's own failures and its incapacity to deal with the current situation. I mean, it's not a first, to sort of blame international actors for your own failures. It's actually quite demeaning, I would say, sort of belittling of normal Ecuadorian people's capacity to analyze the situation they find themselves in, to have, to take it upon themselves to decide to go out in demonstrations and to oppose the government. I can assure you, if you speak to Ecuadorians, they're sort of very, they're very unhappy with the economic package that's been presented to them last week. And I would go further. I think there are more longer-term causes to the unrest, to the current unrest, that go back to when President Moreno was sworn into power in May 2017. Over the last 2.5 years, we've seen a sort of growth of discontent in Ecuador that's led to this current situation. I mean, even before the protests, President Moreno was on 14% approval ratings in the latest polls. Mm-hmm. That's surely not an international conspiracy. It's actually Ecuadorian people being unhappy with the neoliberal structural adjustment, the persecution of opponents, and the general mismanagement of the economy. Okay. Today, the media's focus is on whether this is an international conspiracy. Yesterday, the media's focus was actually on the huge human rights abuses that were being committed in Ecuador, including the UN pronouncing itself, so on and so forth. So right, I think that's the government's response to yesterday's agenda.
All right, Guillaume, I'll come back to you for more on the longer-term causes that you talked about of this crisis. Let me bring in Colin Harding in Manchester for your thoughts, Colin, on what's happening in Ecuador right now. Do other countries, i.e. Venezuela, have a hand in what's happening in Ecuador right now, as Lenin Moreno claims? Is this a political crisis or an economic one?
Well, there's a certain amount of sympathy between the previous government and Nicolas Maduro's government in Venezuela. I mean, Ecuador, during Correa's time, did line up with other left-wing governments in Latin America. Whether Maduro has the capacity to interfere in what's going on in Ecuador at the moment, I think it's probably rather doubtful. And as has been said by Guillaume Long, there are sufficient reasons about what's going on in Ecuador to provoke protests. I mean, there have been quite radical changes in economic policy in the last couple of years, after 11 years of expansion of the state, increases in public spending and so on. The present government has now made a deal with the IMF, which involves, as we've heard, cuts in public spending and austerity, which hasn't been the case in the last few years in Ecuador, and of course people are objecting.
Let me ask Matias in Quito why indigenous groups are particularly angry with Moreno's plans and this IMF agreement that he reached.
Okay, I think that answer is easy. If you consider that the increase in fuel prices will affect the whole society, obviously it will affect more to the people who has less resources, will affect more to the people who lives in rural areas and has to take their food every day to sell in the markets in the cities using this kind of taxis or lorries. So it's logic to think that the people who will be affected more in their economy is the people who have less.
And so what do the protesters want right now? They are obviously demanding that Moreno resign, but if he does that, which he seems not to be interested in doing right now, then what? I mean, how does that solve the economic crisis?
Okay, I talked to the people from the CONAIE, the Confederation of the Indigenous here in Ecuador. I talked to them a couple of days ago, and they were not interested in Moreno going down. They were asking, at least publicly, they were asking the president to step back with the austerity measures, but they were not specifically asking to change the government. Obviously, after yesterday, after the battle in front of the National Assembly, the shouting in the afternoon was Moreno out. But we don't know exactly at the moment if everyone wants to go to Moreno to step back or to step down.
Right. That's interesting. Guillaume Long in Paris, earlier you talked about the longer-term causes of this crisis. When Moreno was elected in 2017, he inherited a debt crisis. I mean, former President Correa took out loans, we know, for a major dam, for highways, schools and clinics and other projects. And so Moreno's supporters will say that something had to be done about this debt. So if not austerity measures, what are the other alternatives?
Yeah, well, I would disagree with the fact that he inherited a debt crisis. Debt was below 40% of GDP, which is like half of European Union's debt, just to give you an idea. It's pretty low, actually, in international comparative perspective. And in fact, Moreno, in 2.5 years, indebted himself more than Correa did in 10 years. So there's a whole narrative there which has been pushed by the Ecuadorian government, which is strictly and empirically false. In terms of longer-term longer-term causes of this crisis, I think there are a number of elements that have to do with economic, social, but also institutional, political, and democratic erosion. There have been, there's a constitutional crisis every month in Ecuador. So you have to look at this sort of, but you didn't have protests. But there was a simmering discontent. And then suddenly last week, these packages, which, as you rightly said, have to do with fuel, they also have to do with labor rights, and also have to do with macroeconomic policies, suddenly everything came to the fore. And I think it's true that originally people came out on the street not to topple Moreno, but essentially to try and repeal this economic package, which was very unpopular, to try and convince the Moreno administration to go back on the economic measures. But with the tremendous repression that we've seen over the last few days, with a state of emergency, with curfew last night for the first time in decades, with all the images that are being shown and aired on people being, sort of repressed very harshly by the military and by the police force, the message is changing, and you're starting to see people wanting a democratic outcome to this systemic crisis, including new elections.
Colin Harding, why does Ecuador find itself in this current economic crisis? Who is to blame for the debts the country has? And, if not austerity measures, what then?
Well, a very good question. We have a similar situation to Argentina, where you had a left-wing government which greatly increased public spending, which was allied with popular movements and so on. And there's been a sudden change. And of course, this creates a great deal of pushback. And that's what's happened in Ecuador. The Moreno government, as we've heard, claims that it had no alternative but to seek a credit deal with the IMF in order to rescue the country from a growing economic crisis. This is disputed, of course, but the government can see no other way out really at the moment but to pursue the sort of policies which the IMF expects in return for bailing the government out. I think the government has panicked. I think there's not much doubt about that. They have possibly overreacted, and they're seeing conspiracies in what's going on at the moment. I think it's very, very hard now for them to seek any other way out. They are committed now to a rather heavy-handed repression of the protests, and of course this is liable to spiral further.
Right. Well, let's broaden this out a bit and look at what else is happening in the region. Ecuador's president, as we mentioned, scrapped fuel subsidies as part of austerity measures imposed after the International Monetary Fund agreed a $4 billion loan in February. And Ecuador, as Colin pointed out, isn't the only country under IMF pressure to reform its economy and in return for help. Haiti's president cut fuel subsidies last July, but relented following widespread protests there. Jovenel Moïse is still resisting demands to resign because of corruption allegations. Argentina cut public spending in return for the IMF's biggest ever bailout of $57 billion last year. Austerity measures have led to widespread unemployment and the value of the peso falling to record lows. Government statistics show poverty levels grew from 25% 2 years ago to 32% now. Guillaume in Paris, is the IMF being reckless by lending to debt-troubled countries like Argentina and Ecuador?
Yeah, I think if we're to have a much more universal conversation about development and about the role of international institutions and multilateral financial institutions, then yes, I mean, there's a big problem with the IMF. It's a problem we had in Latin America in the 80s and 90s when we were the laboratory for very aggressive, I would say, fundamentalist neoliberal structural adjustment programs. They failed. They created even greater inequality in what was already the most unequal continent in the world. It's very important to understand that if you look at averages, then Latin America is pretty much the middle class of the world, but that's, you know, per capita GDP. But if you look at what that hides, it's the most unequal continent in the world, the most unequal region in the world. And a lot of Latin America's problems have to do directly with this inequality, whether it's urban crime, whether it's lack of social cohesion, political instability. A number of things are the consequence of inequality. And the IMF arrives and adds an extra layer of impoverishment, of inequality, of precariousness. The IMF says the state is the problem in a context with an already absence of state and state regulation. So for 10, 15 years in the early 2000s, you had sort of progressive, some would say left-wing, left-of-center governments that kind of put those multilateral lending institutions on hold or sort of decided to govern without their help. It created, the result of these governments throughout the region was growth, reduction of inequality. Between 2000 and 2012, 90 million people were lifted out of poverty in Latin America. Right. Now the IMF is back, you've just said it. Ecuador and Argentina are good examples. And you've got in Ecuador people going back in poverty. In Argentina, people going back into poverty. So yes, there's a big discussion to be had on the role, and a nefarious role, I would say, of the IMF wherever it goes in the world, particularly in the developing world.
Before we bring back Matias into the conversation to find out where this crisis in Ecuador could head, let me ask Colin about his thoughts on the role of the IMF. Are these programs, whether it's in Ecuador, Argentina, or even Haiti, are they helping these countries at all? Is there a benefit anywhere?
Well, the argument is, of course, that the measures are not necessarily popular in the short term, but they will stabilize the economy and set the agenda for growth again. But of course, this is expecting people to be patient, and while their perceived standard of living is going down, so this is very difficult. The IMF is not popular in Latin America. It's particularly unpopular particularly in Argentina, for instance, but also in Ecuador. To sign up to a program with the IMF these days is asking for trouble, and of course we know that the Indigenous movement, CONAIE, has a track record of bringing governments down when they follow austerity policies, unpopular policies. So the government is committed to trying to carry out the IMF program, but they may well have to start backtracking, as we've seen in Haiti.
Matias, you're on the ground. How do you see the situation unfolding in the next few days and next few weeks? The government has said it's open to dialogue, it's open to mediation through the United Nations or the Catholic Church, but the Indigenous movement doesn't seem to be interested in dialogue for now. So what's likely to happen?
I think today is the day, because today is the day that the whole group of Indigenous people arrived to the capital city. Today is the day declared as a national strike day. I was talking to the Indigenous people yesterday and they told me, okay, we try with the National Assembly, but maybe tomorrow that we are all together, we go to the presidential palace. So we will see what happens in the next hours with the protest. I wouldn't try to think in next weeks. I would say day by day, hour by hour.
All right. Guillaume in Paris, your thoughts on how all this could unfold in the coming days and coming weeks. We've had the Organization of American States, the OAS, coming out in support of Lenin Moreno, saying that while they support peaceful protests, they reject any form of interruption of Moreno's government. What's likely to happen? Will Moreno, eventually have to leave power, you think?
Just a quick return on the IMF. I don't actually think it's short-term pain for long-term gains. I actually believe the IMF is offside on all the issues on development. It's not really discussing how to change the role as raw materials exporters to beat the boom and bust cycles and so on. So I think there's a much more complex discussion to be had on the IMF worldwide. On Ecuador, the Moreno government has already fled the capital, right? It's the seat of government right now is not the capital, Quito, but Guayaquil. It's had to resort to a huge amount of repression in order to be able to maintain itself in power. We'll have to see today, the coming days are going to be decisive. A number of indigenous people arriving in Quito. We'll have to see whether what's been going on for now 8 days is still keeping with the same momentum. If it does, anything's possible. We've had it in the past, in 97, in 2000 and 2005. And the big question is whether the military will carry on supporting Moreno or whether they'll come, a lot of people in the military come from humble origins and they have family in the kind of popular sectors of society. Will they say at some point, Mr. Moreno, your time's up, we can't guarantee your security anymore, we need new elections? I mean, unfortunately, because it's a very unfortunate conclusion to come to, the military are becoming once again the arbiters of the political game, and it shouldn't be like that. And
for the time being, Colin Harding, the military seems to be supporting Moreno. We saw him flanked by the defense minister when he was making his address just a day or so ago. How much longer do you think he can maintain himself in power? And do you agree with Guillaume in Paris that the military will be the deciding factor here?
Well, yes, I think I do. It's very important that the military support the president. As we've seen in the recent crisis in Peru, I mean, the president appeared on television flanked by military officers to show that he still has the support of the armed forces. The support of the armed forces has been crucial to keeping Nicolas Maduro in power in Venezuela. So they clearly have a very crucial role to play. Whether they will start wavering, we'll have to see. But I think the government is not handling the situation particularly well. They have panicked. And as Guillaume says, they've sort of fled to Guayaquil on the coast, which doesn't make it look as if they're in control. I think they're going to have to calm down and see if they can establish some kind of means for dialogue. But of course, things are liable to come to a head in the next day or two, and we'll have to see how they react to the growing protests.
And indeed, we'll keep a close eye on the situation in Ecuador here on Al Jazeera. Gentlemen, thank you very much for a very interesting discussion. Matias, Zibell, Guillaume Long and Colin Harding, thank you for joining us on Inside Story. And thank you for watching. You can always watch this program again anytime by visiting our website at aljazeera.com. For further discussion, go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on Twitter, of course. Our handle is at AJ Inside Story. From me, Folly, Thibault, and the whole team, thank you for watching. Bye for now.